The morning Eli Redmond found the first canteen hanging from his saddle horn, he thought one of the boys at the livery had left it there as a joke. It was early October of 1878, the kind of morning that came down on Harlan Creek, Texas, like a wool blanket soaked in cold river water, gray sky pressing low, the smell of sage and coming rain hanging heavy in the air. Eli had been riding patrol for the Harlan County Land Office for going on 3 years, and his routine was fixed as the stars. Up before dawn, coffee brewed on the small iron stove in his rented room above the feed store, saddle on his gelding biscuit, by the time the horizon turned the faintest shade of amber. But that morning there it was, a battered tin canteen, its leather strap looped carefully over the saddle horn, the cork seated tight. He lifted it and shook it, heard the satisfying slosh of water inside, and frowned at the livery yard around him. The stable hand, a boy of about 14 named Clem, was sweeping near the far stall and shook his head before Eli even opened his mouth. "Don't look at me, Mr. Redmond. Wasn't there when I started my chores." Eli turned the canteen over in his hands. It was old and dented, the tin worn smooth by long use, and there was a strip of clean rawhide tied around the neck of it in a careful, small knot. Not a man's knot, he thought. Too neat. He hung it from his own saddle beside his regular one and rode out. He didn't think much more about it that day. He had bigger matters pressing. The winter was coming early that year, and the range disputes between the Mackey cattle operation and 3 smaller homesteading families to the north had been simmering since midsummer. Eli's job was not exactly a lawman's job and not exactly a surveyor's job. It fell somewhere between the two, which meant everybody was unhappy with him half the time. He measured the land, documented the claims, and tried to keep the peace while doing it. He was 28 years old and had a reputation for being fair, which in Harlan Creek was the closest thing a man could have to both a compliment and a target painted on his back. The second morning, another canteen. This one was also filled with water, but there was something else. A square of cloth was tucked under the strap, white cotton, clean, and folded around 3 dried biscuits and a handful of late-season dried berries. His stomach turned over with something he couldn't name. He was a practical man, and his first instinct was still to assume some kind of mistake or mischief. He asked Clem again, asked the liveryman himself, a widower named Barrows who smelled permanently of horse liniment. Neither man had seen a soul. The livery gate was unlocked through the night because Barrows was trusting to a fault and always had been. "Whoever it is, they're coming in quiet," Barrows said, not seeming particularly bothered. Eli ate the biscuits on the ride out because he hadn't had breakfast and they were good. Whoever had made them had done so with care. They were dense and slightly sweet, the way you made them when you wanted them to last rather than to impress. Third morning, another canteen. This time wrapped in a piece of burlap, and inside the burlap, a small bundle of dried meat. The meat was thin-cut and salted well and had been dried over a low fire, the way people who knew what they were doing dried their meat, not the sloppy jerky you bought off a supply wagon. Careful work. He began paying attention. He started watching the livery from the window of his room before dawn. He moved his chair to face the street and left his lamp dark and told himself he was just being cautious. But 2 mornings he sat there in the cold dark and saw nothing. Only the street dogs moving through the shadows and Clem arriving with his lantern at first light. The 4th morning, the canteen was there again, and this time there was something different. Alongside it, draped over the saddle like it had been placed with great deliberateness, was a small sprig of dried wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek banks, pale yellow things that had gone brown and brittle with the advancing season. He stood there in the livery holding that sprig for longer than a sensible man should have, feeling a strange warmth moving through his chest that he did not have a name for. He asked around town. He was subtle about it because he was a subtle man by nature, more inclined to observe than to interrogate. He asked the woman who ran the boarding house on Clement Street if she had any new guests. He asked the postmaster if there had been any recent arrivals registering mail. He even asked Father Donahue over at the small Catholic mission on the south end of town if he'd seen any new faces. Everyone said the same thing. It had been a quiet few weeks. No one new in town. He rode a wider patrol that day, his eyes moving over the landscape with a different kind of attention. He crossed 3 homesteads and the edges of the Mackay Range, nodded to 2 Comanche riders who were moving south along the creek with a string of horses. They had papers, legal passage, and he knew them well enough to exchange a few words. He passed through the ruins of a ranch that had been abandoned 2 seasons back after the owner, a man named Carver, had died of a fever. He almost rode past it. He actually did ride past it, went another quarter-mile and then stopped Biscuit and sat very still in the saddle. Carver. He turned that name over in his mind. He remembered the case. A homestead claim, about 120 acres, filed 7 years back by a man named Thomas Carver who had come out of Missouri with his wife and built up a modest cattle operation. Thomas Carver had died in the spring of 1876. He had been to that funeral himself because it was in his job to document deaths of landholders. He remembered a widow. He remembered her because he had been moved by the dignity with which she had stood at that grave, a small woman in a dark dress with her jaw set like stone. He turned Biscuit around and rode back to the Carver place. The house was a low stone and adobe structure, its wooden additions looking weathered and gray. The corral fence had partly fallen. The kitchen garden that had once run along the south wall was dormant, its raised beds sunken and weed-choked. But there was a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney. Very thin. The kind a person made when they were trying not to be noticed. He dismounted at the gate and stood a moment, hand resting on the fence post, reading the yard. There was a horse, a bay mare in poor shape, standing in the corner of the lean-to, hip-shot and with ribs showing through her coat. There were fresh boot prints in the mud near the water trough, small prints, a woman's boots. He did not call out. Something in him said to be careful, not afraid, just careful. He walked to the door and knocked. Silence. He knocked again. "Ma'am, my name is Eli Redmond. I work for the county land office. I'm not here about the property. I just want to talk." A long pause, then the sound of something moving inside. The door opened 3 inches, held by a leather cord, and a single dark eye looked out at him from the shadow within. He took off his hat. He always took his hat off when he spoke to a woman, and he did it without thinking. "Are you Nora Carver?" he asked. The eye did not blink. "Who wants to know?" "I already said, Eli Redmond. I work for the land office out of Harlan Creek." He paused. "I've been finding canteens on my saddle." The door closed. He heard the cord being removed. Then it opened properly all the way, and he got his first clear look at Nora Carver. She was something. That was the word that arrived in his mind without warning and sat there with stubborn permanence. Something. Not a word he typically assigned to people. She was not tall, maybe 5.5 feet, with dark hair that had been pinned up with efficiency rather than care, and several pieces of which had escaped down her neck. Her face was fine-boned and sun-browned, with dark eyes that were watching him with an intelligence and wariness that reminded him of a hawk watching from a post. She was thin. Thin in the way that alarmed him, the way that was not natural thinness but the kind that came from not having enough. Her cheekbones were too prominent, her dress, a faded blue, hung loose. She was gripping the door frame with one hand and looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between defiant and exhausted. "You tracked me here," she said. It was not a question. "I did," he said. "You've been leaving water on my saddle for 4 days. Good water, clean water, and food." He paused. "Ma'am, you're half-starved yourself. Why are you doing it?" Her jaw tightened. "You ride a long route," she said. "I've watched you, 6, 7 hours in the saddle every day." The creek's been drying up on the north section. Didn't think it was right, a man riding that country without enough water. He stared at her. "You were watching out for me." "It's only Christian," she said, the defiance rising sharper now, as if daring him to make something sentimental of it. He looked at her. He looked at the hollows under her cheekbones, at the thin wrists, at the way the bay mare had ribs showing in the lean-to. He looked at the kitchen garden gone to weed, and the crumbled fence, and the thin thread of smoke from a fire burning small to save wood. He understood in a single clear moment the full scope of what she had been doing. She had been giving away water she could not spare, making food with flour and stores she was rationing, and leaving it for a stranger who rode past her abandoned homestead every morning. He put his hat back on his head. "Come eat," he said. She blinked. "What? Come eat, right now. Come into Harlan Creek with me and eat a meal." He watched her face move through several things at once: surprise, pride, hunger, suspicion, and he held steady through all of it. "You've fed me for 4 days, Mrs. Carver. Let me return the courtesy." "I don't need charity," she said, and her voice had gone tight and hard. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a meal in return for 4 meals you gave me." "That's just arithmetic." Something shifted in her face. The hawk look softened barely, but it was there. She looked past him at Biscuit, who was standing at the gate chewing on nothing, entirely indifferent to the human drama unfolding nearby. Then she looked back at Eli. "I need to water the mare first," she said. "I'll help you," he said. He helped her draw water from the well, which was low but not dry, and between them they got the mare watered, and a small measure of grain from what little remained in the feed bin. The mare was gentle, clearly well cared for in better times. Nora moved around her with affection and easy familiarity that told him everything he needed to know about who Nora Carver was at her core. When they rode into Harlan Creek together, Nora on her bay mare and Eli on Biscuit, side by side on the packed dirt road with the October sky pressing low and gray above them, he was acutely aware of the fact that he had not in 3 years felt the company of another person with such acute and immediate weight. He took her to Dorsey's, the only proper dining room in Harlan Creek, which occupied a wood-framed building on Main Street between the telegraph office and the hardware store. It was run by a large, cheerful woman named Alma Dorsey, who had come out from Tennessee a decade ago, and whose cooking had earned her the devoted patronage of every working man in the county. Alma took one look at Nora Carver and said nothing that needed saying, just led her to a table by the window and went directly to the kitchen. Within minutes there was a full meal in front of Nora: chicken and gravy, bread, stewed tomatoes, a wedge of cornbread, and a large pot of tea. Eli watched Nora's face and saw the way her whole body stilled for just a moment when the food appeared. A brief involuntary stillness, like a person who has been walking a long time finally seeing level ground ahead. She ate with restraint. He noticed that too. She ate like a woman who was deeply, fiercely hungry but was determined not to show it, taking careful bites, chewing slowly, keeping her spine straight in the chair. It made something ache in him that he did not entirely understand. He ate too, and he let the silence settle between them without trying to fill it, which he had learned was the best way to let a person feel comfortable. He was not a man who needed to talk. He had grown up in a quiet house, raised by a taciturn father who had owned a hardware store in San Antonio, and the habit of watchful quiet had stayed with him. Nora Carver spoke first. "How long have you been at the land office?" she asked. 3 years, he said. "Came up from San Antonio after a friend of mine took a position here and said they needed someone who could read a survey line and talk to people at the same time. I could do both, apparently." "You're not a marshal." "No, not quite." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I work for the county, keep records, settle boundary disputes, document claims. It's mostly paperwork and writing and occasionally standing between 2 angry men with a survey map and hoping neither of them shoots me." The corner of her mouth lifted, just barely, but it was there. "Has anyone ever shot you?" "Once," he said, "but it was a mistake. He was trying to shoot my horse." She did look at him then fully with those dark, watchful eyes. "And you found that funny?" "Funnier than if it had been me," he said. She looked down at her plate, and that small, reluctant, almost smile came again, and he felt it like a thing with physical weight settling somewhere in the center of his chest. After the meal, he ordered pie because Alma's pie was not to be passed on. When it arrived, 2 slices of dried apple with a thick pastry crust, Nora stared at it for a moment before picking up her fork, and that moment told him more about the duration of her hardship than anything she had said. He didn't pry. He didn't ask about the property or the financial situation or how she had come to be living alone in a half-ruined homestead watching him ride past every morning. He understood that all of that would either come when she was ready or it would not come, and either way it was her right. But she told him. Maybe it was the food, or the warmth of the room, or the fact that he had asked for nothing and pushed for nothing. She set down her fork and told him about the 2 years since Thomas had died. Thomas Carver had come out from Missouri with a plan, and he had worked that plan hard for 7 years, and they had built something real on that 120 acres. Cattle, a kitchen garden, a smokehouse, a good well, a house that was small but solid. They had a son, James, who had died at age 4 of scarlet fever the second winter, and after that the land had become even more important to both of them, a reason, a purpose, a thing to fill the space that the loss had left. Then Thomas had got the fever in April of 1876, and in 3 weeks he was gone, and Nora had been left with the property, the debt on the cattle purchase, a bay mare, and the particular silence of a house that had held 2 people and then held only one. She had tried. She was not the kind of woman who did not try. She had sold the cattle to pay the debt. She had taken in mending and washing. She had grown what she could and dried what she could and saved what she could. But the drought the previous summer had taken the garden and the well had dropped. The lease renewal on the property had been complicated because Thomas had filed the original claim in both their names, but the county clerk, a man named Harbert who Eli knew and did not particularly like, had told her that as a woman she had no standing to renew without a male co-signatory. She had argued. She had written letters. She had continued to live in the house because it was her home, and she was not going anywhere. But the legal status of the claim had drifted into a gray area that meant she was also not receiving her rightful status as a documented holder. Eli listened to all of this, and his expression did not change. But inside something settled into a very quiet, very particular kind of anger. The kind that was not hot and loud but cold and methodical and purposeful. He said, "The clerk told you that you need a co-signatory to renew. He told me women can't hold independent title." "He is incorrect," Eli said, and his voice was level and factual. "The Texas homestead law has provisions for widow-held claims. It's not common practice, and Harbert knows how to use that to his advantage, but it's not legal. I have the codes in my office." She looked at him for a long moment. "You'd help me with that." "It's my job," he said, which was true, but they both understood it was not the whole truth. She paid for her own meal. He tried to pay, and she refused with a firmness that was absolute, putting down exact coin and folding her hands on the table in a way that communicated the discussion was over. He respected it. He paid for his own. They rode back out of town together in the late afternoon, the sky having cleared to a thin winter blue, the sage catching the low-angled light in a way that turned the land gold and silver. He rode with her all the way back to her gate, which was more than was strictly necessary. He said, "Don't leave any more canteens." She looked at him sharply. "You can't spare them," he said, a pause. Her chin came up. "I'll leave what I choose." "Then I'll bring you breakfast in exchange," he said, "every morning." Equal trade. She stared at him, and he met that stare without blinking, and finally she said, "That's not necessary." "No," he agreed, "but it's what I'll do." He tipped his hat and rode back toward town, and he did not look back, but he was smiling by the time he was a quarter-mile gone. The 5th morning, there was another canteen on his saddle. Of course there was. He rode out to the Carver place with 2 wrapped-up portions of Alma's breakfast, eggs and bacon and buttered bread packed carefully in a cloth sack. He left them hanging from her gate post because he was not going to make this awkward or presumptuous. He did not knock on her door. He just left the food and rode on. He had the canteen. He would drink from it through the day. It was good water. That afternoon, he went to the county office and pulled the homestead codes himself. reading through them with the methodical attention he gave to survey problems. He made notes. He pulled Carver's original filing, which was indeed in both Thomas and Nora's names, which meant she had co-ownership, and the right of survivorship was implicitly written into the terms under the community property provisions of Texas law. Harbert had either genuinely misread the law or had decided to misread it, and knowing Harbert, Eli had a clear view of which was more likely. He drafted a formal letter of claim renewal on Nora's behalf, citing the relevant statutes, and brought it to Harbert the following morning. Harbert was a red-faced man in his mid-50s who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat and who had a long history of finding ways to make things difficult for people who did not have the resources to push back. He looked at Eli's letter and then at Eli. "She sent you," he said. "She doesn't know I'm here," Eli said. "This is a matter of record-keeping and I am doing my job." Harbert tapped the letter on his desk. "The county judge would need to review this." "Then submit it to the county judge," Eli said pleasantly. "I'll note in my own records that the submission was made today and the date of your response." Harbert did not like this. He sat with it for a long moment and then stamped the intake form with more force than was needed. "It'll take some weeks," he said. "I'll be watching the calendar," Eli said. He rode out to the Carver place that afternoon for the first time without breakfast as his excuse. He knocked on the door and Nora opened it without the cord this time, which he registered as progress of a kind. He took off his hat and told her what he had done. He watched her face go through something complicated and controlled, the pride and the gratitude fighting each other behind her eyes. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "You told me what was happening," he said. "That's not nothing." "I don't want to be a problem you're solving," she said, and there was something raw in the words, something that went below the surface of the practical situation. He looked at her. "You're not a problem," he said. "You're a person. A capable person who got handed a situation that wasn't fair, and I have the tools to help with one part of it. That's all this is." She looked at him for a long while, and then she stepped back from the door and said, "I have coffee on if you want." He did want. They sat at the kitchen table, which was rough-hewn pine worn smooth with years of use, and drank coffee from chipped tin cups, and Eli Redmond understood that he was in trouble in the best possible sense of the word. He had not sat across a kitchen table from a woman since longer than was comfortable to admit. His life had been narrow and purposeful and largely solitary, not from lack of feeling but from lack of opportunity, and from a certain caution in himself that he had never entirely analyzed. Nora Carver's kitchen was spare but clean, and there were small signs of the woman she was everywhere you looked. A dried herb bundle hanging near the window, a worn copy of a Methodist hymnal on the shelf, beside a small framed portrait of Thomas that she had placed in a position that was respectful and present but not central, as if she had made a deliberate peace with the past. A corn broom hung by the door, immaculate. On the windowsill, in a cracked earthenware cup, was a small cluster of the same dried wildflowers she had left on his saddle. He asked her about herself, where she was from, what her life had looked like before Thomas, before the West. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children, a farming family of modest means and fierce self-sufficiency. Her mother had been a woman who could do anything: candles, medicines, preserves, dressmaking, midwifing, and Nora had absorbed all of it the way a dry river bed absorbs rain. She had married Thomas at 21, followed him west at 22, and now she was 27, and she said that with the matter-of-fact composure of a woman who had put away a number of things she had planned to feel later when she had time. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked. "On the property, in this county, in this life?" He meant all of those things, and she seemed to understand that. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It's mine. It's what Thomas and I built. I'm not leaving it." Something in that declaration settled in him like a stone finding the bottom of deep water, sure and final and right. He came back the next day with a load of firewood in the bed of the small wagon he borrowed from the land office. He didn't make a project of it. He just unloaded it and stacked it against the house, and she came out of the door and stood watching him with her arms folded and said, "You are very difficult to argue with." "I've been told that," he said. She came and helped him stack it. They worked in a comfortable parallel silence, the kind that you only found with people whose company was easy, and the morning light was clear and cold, and the smoke was rising from the chimney, and the bay mare was watching them from the linta with interested dark eyes. This became the rhythm. He rode his patrol. He drank from the canteen she still left on his saddle no matter what he said about it, and on the days his route carried him near the Carver place he stopped. Sometimes he brought things. Alma had taken to sending food out with him without being asked, wrapped in cloth, because Alma was a woman who understood human situations without needing them explained. Sometimes he brought nothing but himself, and that was fine too. They fixed her fence together. He dug the new post holes and she drove the rails, which she was better at than him because she had a precision with the mallet that he lacked, and he told her so honestly, and she accepted the compliment without false modesty, which he appreciated greatly. They talked while they worked. They talked about everything and nothing, the way you did when you were getting to know someone, and the conversation was both the purpose and the pleasure at once. She had strong opinions about land management and the injustice of the way the county courts handled homestead claims, particularly for women, and particularly for the smaller operations that could not afford legal representation. She was right about all of it, and he told her so. And then they got into a long discussion about the territorial land reform debates happening up in the state legislature, which she knew more about than he had expected, having read what newspapers she could get her hands on. She was sharp. She was funny in a dry, very quiet way that caught you off guard. She had a way of saying things with no visible humor on her face that were nonetheless precisely, perfectly funny, and the first time she did it, he had laughed genuinely, and she had looked at him with what he could only describe as pleased surprise, as if she had not expected him to catch it. He thought about her constantly. He rode his patrol and watched the landscape and thought about her. He lay in his room above the feed store in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about her. He was not a man accustomed to this kind of preoccupation, and he found it both alarming and deeply, entirely welcome. Clem at the livery noticed the canteens and started making small comments of a teasing nature that Eli took without visible reaction, but which he also could not help finding slightly satisfying. The 6th week arrived, and with it, cold. The weather turned hard the first week of November, which was early even by Texas standards. A norther came through on a Thursday and dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon, and Eli went out on his patrol with his heavy coat and his gloves and found the canteen as always, hanging from the saddle horn, but this time it was frozen solid. Whatever water she had put in it had iced overnight. He held the frozen canteen in his gloved hand and looked at it for a long time. 6 weeks. She had been doing this for 6 weeks, every single morning without a miss, walking to the livery in the dark and hanging a canteen on his saddle, returning to her half-cold house with its thin fire and her rationed stores. Doing it because she had seen him riding long days in dry country and had decided, in the quiet private logic of her own heart, that this was something she could do for someone else even when she had very little left. He went directly to the Carver place. It was not on his patrol route that day. It did not matter. She was outside when he arrived, trying to mend a gap in the adobe wall where the freeze had worked loose a section of the outer plaster, her hands wrapped in cloth strips because she had not enough proper gloves. She turned when she heard Biscuit on the road, and she had mud on her cheek and her breath was coming in white puffs, and she looked at him with the same clear, direct gaze she always had. He held up the frozen canteen. Her expression shifted slightly. Something careful came into her eyes. 6 weeks, he said, every morning. You already told me to stop, she said, but there was no real defense in it. He dismounted and went to the gate and opened it, and he walked to her, and he stood closer than he normally did, Not close enough to be reckless, but close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze, and he said, "Come eat, Nora." She blinked at the use of her first name, which he had not used before. He watched something move through her eyes: surprise, recognition, something deeper and more complicated. "Eli," she said, and the sound of his own name in her voice was something he felt in his chest. "I'm inside and I'll make the fire up," he said, "and then I'm taking you into town and we're going to eat a proper meal and I'm going to tell Alma to cook whatever she thinks you need." He paused. "And then there's something I want to say to you if you'll let me." Her chin stayed up. Her eyes stayed on his. "What is it you want to say?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the sage and the cold was absolute and clean. "I'd like to say it in a warm room," he said. Something happened in her face. It was not the hawk look. It was not the carefully maintained composure. It was something softer and more honest, a flicker of something she had been keeping locked away, and it surfaced for just a second before she reined it back. "All right," she said. He built the fire up and got the house warm, and then they rode into Harlan Creek together in the pale winter sunshine, their horses close on the narrow road, their breath and the horse's breath rising together in the cold air. Alma, who had a gift for reading a room, settled them at the corner table and brought out everything she had worn, and she disappeared into the kitchen with conspicuous tact. Nora ate with less restraint this time, which told him that the weeks of him leaving food at the gate and the meals they had shared had done something real for her, and that knowledge settled in him with a quiet satisfaction. He waited until she had her coffee and was warm and settled before he spoke. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to take it for what it is and nothing else." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I've been doing this work for 3 years and I've been largely content with it. I'm good at it. I believe it matters. But I've been living a fairly reduced sort of life, a practical life." He looked at her. "And then someone started leaving canteens on my saddle, and I don't know how else to say this except plainly. You changed something for me, Nora." She was very still. "The fact that you had so little and spent what you had on water for a man you didn't know," he said, "that is one of the most—" He stopped, tried again. "I have never known anyone like you. And I am aware that this is a complicated time for you and that your life has been hard, and that what you need from me, practically, is the help I can give you with the land claim and the supply situation. I'm not trying to make this complicated." He met her eyes. "I just didn't want to go another morning without you knowing that you matter to me, considerably." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind was up, scraping along the boardwalk. Inside, the dining room was warm and it smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Nora Carver set down her cup. She looked at him with those dark eyes for a long moment, and he waited, because he was a patient man, and because he understood that she needed to come to whatever she came to in her own time. "Thomas has been gone for 2 years," she said at last, "and I haven't let myself think about anything beyond the next season, the next month, the next day sometimes." She paused. "I left those canteens because it was one small thing I could do, one way of being useful when everything else felt like it was slipping." Her voice was steady, but her hands around her cup were tight. "I didn't think about you specifically at first. You were just a man who rode a long route in dry country." She looked at him. "And then I started thinking about you specifically." He held very still. "I watched you," she said. "I'm not ashamed to say it. I watched you from the ridge above the north section some mornings. The way you handled that gelding, the way you stopped to look at the land. You were careful. Not careful in the way of a man who is afraid, but careful in the way of a man who respects things." She paused again, a longer pause. "I thought about you considerably too, Eli Redmond." He looked at her. He said, "What do you want to do about that?" She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the small, reluctant, almost smile, but a real one, and it was devastating in the best possible way, transforming the careful, controlled face into something luminous and warm. "I think," she said, "that I want you to keep coming to my kitchen for coffee." "I can do that," he said, "and I want you to stop bringing me food as though I'm a charity case." The moment the land claim is resolved and you've had a proper growing season, I'll stop, he said. She considered this with the pragmatism that was one of the things he liked best about her. Fair enough, she said. And he said, I'd like to take you to the fall dance on Saturday if you'd let me. She looked at him. There's a dance on Saturday. There's always a dance at the Grange Hall in November. I've gone alone the last 3 years. He paused. I would prefer not to go alone this year. Her smile, which had faded to its quieter form, came back. All right, she said. Yes. They rode back out in the late afternoon, and at the gate of the Carver place they paused, and in the low, slanting winter light she looked at him from the back of her bay mare and said, No more canteens if you're going to take me to dances. That seems like a poor trade, he said. It's a very good trade, she said, and turned her horse toward the yard, and he watched her go with a feeling he had no prior experience of, something large and lit and entirely certain. The dance was held on Saturday in the Grange Hall on the north side of Harlan Creek, a long building with plank floors and high rafters, and 3 lanterns strung along each beam. Half the county showed up for it because the social calendar in Harlan Creek in 1878 was not an overcrowded thing, and people took their festivities seriously. There was a fiddle player named Old Pete, who was not actually very old, and a man with a squeeze box who came down from the Mackey Range, and someone had brought a jug of cider that was technically not cider, and the whole place smelled of pine resin and lamp oil and perfume, applied with sincere effort by women who did not own much of it. Eli arrived first and waited near the door. When Nora Carver came in, he understood for the first time what the word arrested meant in its truest non-legal sense. She had dressed with care in a way that she clearly had not dressed in a very long time, a dark green dress he had not seen before, fitted at the waist, her hair pinned up properly with what looked like genuine tortoiseshell pins, her face clean of the tiredness that usually lived in it, her eyes bright and watchful and alive. She looked like herself but fuller, like a woman coming back into herself after a long absence. She walked up to him and said, You look alarmed. I look impressed, he said. She looked at him with a sideways assessment. He had worn his good vest and his cleanest shirt, and had managed to get a barber to look at his hair that afternoon. She gave a small approving nod, and he felt, absurdly, 17 years old. They danced. He was not a graceful man, but he was competent, and he did not step on her feet, which he understood to be the core criterion by which men were judged at country dances. She danced with an ease that surprised him. She had a natural, sure rhythm, and she followed him without thinking about it, which made him lead better than he normally did. Alma Dorsey watched them from beside the cider jug with an expression of profound satisfaction, and Eli noticed this without being able to prevent it. They danced 3 dances together, and Eli was asked to dance once by the Mackey foreman's wife, and Nora was asked to dance by a man named Collins who worked at the hardware store, and who was clearly taken with her. And Eli watched that dance from across the room with a feeling he identified correctly as jealousy, which was new and informative. When Collins brought her back, Eli was there to hand her a cup of cider, and Collins took one look at the 2 of them together and apparently concluded something accurate, because he found reasons to be elsewhere almost immediately. Outside, between the 3rd and 4th set, they stood on the step in the cold and looked at the stars, which were enormous over the flat November land, the Milky Way spread across the sky like a bolt of cloth. I haven't been to a dance since before Thomas died, she said. Was that hard, being here tonight? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. It was for about 10 minutes, she said. And then it wasn't, and that felt strange. Like I needed to feel guilty about it not being hard. You don't, he said. I know, she said. I'm telling you about the feeling, not agreeing with it. He understood the distinction and was glad she made it. You're allowed to enjoy yourself, Nora. I know that too, she said. She looked at the stars. I just haven't had much cause to practice it. He looked at her profile against the star-bright sky. I'd like to give you cause to practice it, he said, regularly, on an ongoing basis. She turned and looked at him, and there was a quality of held breath in the moment, and then she said, "Are you courting me, Eli Redmond?" "I'm attempting to," he said. "I thought I was being fairly clear." She looked at him for a long moment, and the stars were overhead, and the fiddle was going inside, and the cold wrapped around them both, and she said, "All right." He offered his arm, and she took it, and they went back inside. He drove her home in the borrowed wagon that night, her mare tied behind, and at the gate he handed her down and held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she let him. And that small thing was enormous. She went through the gate, and he watched her light her lamp in the window, and then he drove back to town in the dark, grinning at the road like a fool. The weeks that followed had a quality unlike anything Eli Redmond had experienced before in his sober, purposeful, largely solitary adult life. He was courting a woman. He was properly, actively, intentionally courting Nora Carver, and the world appeared to have acquired an additional level of detail and texture as a result. He called on her properly 3 times a week, riding out after his patrol work was done in the afternoon. Nora never made it easy, by which he meant she never pretended to things she did not feel or performed warmth she did not have, and that honesty was one of the things he valued most. But the warmth that was genuinely there was considerable, growing warmer with each week, each conversation, each afternoon at the kitchen table where she made good coffee, and they talked about everything. They talked about the land reform movement, which she had strong and well-reasoned views on. They talked about the Indian Territory situation, which Eli had complex feelings about. He had ridden long enough in this land to understand that the official narrative being printed in the newspapers was not the whole truth, that the Comanche and Apache and others who had been pushed out of their territories had been wronged in ways that were both old and ongoing. And Nora agreed with him on this without hesitation or political caution, which told him again that she was a woman of genuine conscience. They had both seen what the removal policies had done, and neither of them had the comfort of pretending it was just. He told her about his own history, about his father, the hardware man, a good quiet man who had worked himself steady and died early, about his mother, who had been from a Mexican family in San Antonio and who had been beautiful and fierce and had died of a fever when he was 11, about the particular mix of his own background, half Anglo, half Mexican, which in Texas in 1878 meant he had learned early to exist in more than one space at once, and to let other people's categories wash off him. Nora listened to all of this with the complete respectful attention she gave to everything, and said that it helped her understand the particular quality of his patience, which she had noticed. "Is it obvious?" he asked, somewhat surprised. "You're the most patient man I've ever met," she said. "I assumed it came from somewhere real." He thought about that. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's just practice." "What have you been practicing patience on?" "Finding you," he said, and the directness of it surprised them both, and she looked at her coffee cup for a moment and said nothing, but the color in her cheeks deepened and stayed. In late November, the county judge's response came back on the Carver land claim. The ruling was in Nora's favor. The original co-filing and the community property provisions were upheld. The renewal was granted, and her title was confirmed clear and hers. Eli brought the papers out personally, tied with the county seal, and she took them and read them on the porch in the winter light, and then she pressed them flat to her chest and closed her eyes. He stood at the gate and did not say anything. After a moment she opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "Thank you, Eli." "You had the right," he said. "It was just a matter of making Harbert admit it." She went inside for a moment and came back with an envelope she handed to him. In it was a folded paper with careful writing, and when he opened it, it was the account of the original homestead, a detailed description of the 120 acres, the well, the improvements, written in her hand in the neat, clear cursive of a woman who had been well taught. "I wrote that out," she said, "because I wanted there to be a record in my own words of what this place is. Not just the county record. My record." She paused. "I want you to have a copy." He looked at the paper in his hands. It was one of the finest things anyone had ever given him. December arrived and the land settled into its winter quiet, the brown grass crackling underfoot, the creek running shallow and cold, the hills to the north showing a skim of white on their tops some mornings. Eli had begun making repairs on the Carver property in earnest, always with her working alongside him, always as partnership rather than charity, which was the only way she would accept it. They replastered the crumbled adobe section. They reseated 2 windows that had been letting in the cold. He brought 2 extra cords of wood and stacked them against the south wall. The bay mare, whose name was Clover, was filling out now that she had proper feed, and Nora moved around her with the quiet pride of a woman watching something she loved come back to health. One afternoon in mid-December, working together to seal a gap in the roof of the lean-to before the next freeze, he was up on the roof's edge and she was handing up the tar and brush from below, and she said, without preamble, "I think about you when you're not here." He stopped working. "I mean to say," she continued, in the careful tone of a person stating a fact they have evaluated thoroughly, "that this, what we are doing, matters to me very much, and I wanted you to know that." He sat on the edge of the lean-to roof with the brush in his hand and looked down at her. She was looking up at him with the directness that was entirely her, not asking for anything, not performing vulnerability, just telling him a true thing. "I think about you all the time," he said. "Constantly. It's becoming a problem for my concentration." She smiled, the real one, and he thought about that smile all the rest of the afternoon. Christmas in Harlan Creek in 1878 was a modest affair by most standards and a very fine one, by the standards of people who had learned to appreciate modest things. The town had a small celebration at the Grange Hall on Christmas Eve, a carol service at Father Donohue's mission, and a general air of determined festivity. Eli had spent the previous week making Nora a gift, which he had done himself because the things available in the single dry goods store were not right. He had carved a small box from cedar wood, fitted with a small hinged lid, and he had lined the inside with a piece of cloth that was the same faded blue as her dress. He had no particular skill at wood carving, and this was evident, but the proportions were good, and it fit in the hands properly. He gave it to her on Christmas morning, riding out to the property before his visit with Alma and the few friends he had in town. She opened it sitting at the kitchen table with the Christmas morning light coming through the window, cold and very clear. She turned the box over in her hands for a long time without speaking. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Eli," she said. "It's not fine work," he said reflexively. "Don't say that," she said. "Don't diminish it." She held it carefully. "You made this with your hands, for me." Her voice was level but barely. "Do you understand how long it's been since someone made me something?" He understood. He understood it completely. She got up from the table and came around it and hugged him, which was the first time she had touched him with her arms around him, and it was brief, and she stepped back immediately with the self-contained manner that was hers, but the warmth of it stayed with him like a fire stays warm in a stone long after the wood is gone. She had made him a gift too, a pair of riding gloves, cut and sewn from the best leather she had, and stitched along the cuffs in a small pattern that was hers alone. He put them on at the table, and they fit as if they had been made for his hands, which they had. January was cold and February was colder, and through it Eli Redmond continued his patrol and his courthouse work and his thrice-weekly visits to the Carver place. And the county of Harlan Creek observed with the cheerful communal attention that small communities gave to courtship and formed collective opinions about it, and Alma Dorsey confirmed those opinions to anyone who asked, and some who did not. They were alone one February afternoon in the kitchen when it happened. He had ridden out with a plan to look at the north fence line and had ended up inside when the weather turned, and they had been sitting together at the table for 2 hours talking, the fire good and hot, the cold pressing at the windows, and Nora had been telling him about her childhood and laughing at something, a real laugh, and he had been watching her laugh, and when it quieted she looked at him and caught the look on his face and went still. He said, "I love you, Nora." The words came out with a simplicity and a weight that surprised even him, and the kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him with those dark eyes for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved. The fire settled. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for some weeks now. I didn't know how to say it." He leaned across the table and kissed her because she was right there and he had wanted to for a very long time, and the moment was exactly right. Her hand came up and rested briefly against his jaw, and when they broke apart she pressed her lips together as if she were keeping something safe, and her eyes were very bright. He said, "I want to marry you." She blinked. "Eli." "I know it's fast," he said. "I know there's a proper amount of time one is supposed to wait. I don't care about the proper amount of time. I want to marry you, and I want you to have this land properly and fully, and I want to see what you grow in that kitchen garden when the spring comes, and I want to build the fence straight, and I want to sit at this table every morning." He paused. "And I want to be with you. I want to be the person who is with you from here forward." She was looking at him with an expression that had gone past careful and past controlled and was simply, fully present, fully her, every line of her face open. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her again, properly this time. And she kissed him back with the same wholehearted, unself-conscious quality she brought to everything she did. And the kitchen was warm and the fire was going, and outside the Texas winter was pressing cold and blue against the glass. They were married in March of 1879 on the front step of the Carver property, because Nora wanted to be married on her land. Father Donahue came out and performed the service, and Alma Dorsey brought food in 3 baskets and set up a makeshift table in the yard. And Clem from the livery came, and so did Barrows, and 2 of the neighboring homestead families, and a couple of the men from the county office, and a dozen others who showed up because in Harlan Creek news traveled at the speed of intention. The 2 Comanche riders who often crossed the North Range came by as well, drawn by the noise, and Nora nodded to them with respect and offered them food from Alma's table, which they accepted with a gravity that was its own form of blessing. The sky that day was the clear, cold blue of early Texas spring, and the land was starting to turn, the first faint green showing in the south-facing slopes, the creek running higher with snowmelt from the north hills. Nora wore the dark green dress. Eli wore his good vest and the riding gloves she had made him, and a clean shirt, and a look on his face that Alma said afterward she would remember for the rest of her life. He moved his things from the room above the feed store and into the Carver house, which became their house, and the presence of 2 people in rooms that had held 1 person too long changed the air of the place in ways that were physical and real. His boots in the hall, his coffee on the stove beside hers, his voice in the evening, her voice answering. Spring came fully, and Nora put in the kitchen garden with a ferocity that was a joy to watch. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had her mother's knowledge and her own 7 years of trial and learning in this specific soil, and she went at the work with a focused energy that was pure pleasure. Eli helped with the heavy work, the turning of the soil and the digging of the irrigation channels, but he was careful to follow her direction on placement and spacing and timing, because it was her knowledge and her garden. The first things came up in April, and she brought them in with a pride that was entirely warranted, and she made a dinner from the first fresh vegetables of the season, and they ate it together at the kitchen table with the window open to the warm evening. "Worth staying for," he said. She looked at him. "It always was," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it palm up and laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the evening light with the spring air coming through the window and the land greening up outside. In June, she told him she was expecting. They were at the well together when she told him, drawing water for the garden in the early morning, and she said it straight out, in the same direct factual manner she used for all the most important things, and Eli set down the bucket and turned to look at her. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be certain." He crossed to her and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and she said, Eli, in the soft, exasperated, fond voice she used when he was being what she called dramatic, which was generally when he was being loving. And he held her for a long moment in the morning warmth with the garden smelling green and watery around them. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice quieter. "More than I can say," he told her. "Are you?" She was quiet for a moment, and he knew she was thinking of the son she had lost, James, the boy who had died when she had been in this place the first time with Thomas. He held her through the complexity of that and did not try to resolve it. "Yes," she said finally. "I am. It's allowed to be both things at once." "It is," he said. The summer was the best one the county had seen in 5 years. The rains came right and the heat was manageable, and the creek ran clear. Nora's garden produced abundantly: tomatoes and squash and dried beans and onions, and the dried herbs that hung in fragrant bundles from every beam in the kitchen. They sold the surplus at the market in Harlan Creek on Saturdays, where Nora quickly developed a reputation for the quality of her dried goods, and the small income from this went into a tin box on the kitchen shelf that she labeled, in her clear hand, for seed and repair. Eli's work had changed somewhat because the land disputes he had been navigating had, through several months of careful documentation and persistent correspondence with the state office, been largely resolved. The Mackey operation had been required to pull their fence line back to the documented survey boundary, which gave the 3 smaller homestead families the access to the creek they had always been entitled to. It had earned Eli the permanent enmity of the Mackey foreman and the permanent gratitude of the homestead families, and he preferred the latter considerably. He was riding back from a documentation survey one August afternoon when he found, hanging from the gate of the Carver property, a clean canteen. He stopped Biscuit at the gate and sat there looking at it. It was one of his own canteens, one that he had left hanging on the porch the previous week when he emptied it. It had been washed and filled and hung from the gate latch with the same neat, rawhide knot she had always used. He took it down and turned it in his hands, and the feeling that moved through him was of the same quality as the feeling he'd had on the morning he had found the first one, that mix of recognition and wonder and something that he now had a better name for. It was love. It had always been love, even that first morning, the world beginning to arrange itself toward what it was trying to become. He rode through the gate and tied Biscuit and walked into the house through the open front door, and Nora was in the kitchen rolling dough at the table with flour on her forearms and her hair pinned up, visibly large with the coming child, and she looked up when he came in and raised her eyebrows. He held up the canteen. She looked at it, then at him. "You were out on a long route today," she said, without a trace of self-consciousness. "The south section is dry this time of year." "Nora," he said. "You needed water," she said, and went back to her rolling, and her voice was completely steady and her face was doing nothing in particular, but the corner of her mouth was turned up in the smallest, most private way. He set the canteen on the table and went around it and put his arms around her from behind, carefully around the considerable roundness of her, and pressed his face into the side of her neck. "You are," he said into the warmth of her skin, "the most extraordinary person." "You say that very often," she said. "It is very frequently true," he said. She laughed, the real one, and covered one of his hands with her floury ones, and they stayed like that in the kitchen in the August afternoon while the bread waited. Their son was born on the 12th of October, 1879, exactly 1 year after the October morning, when Eli had first found a canteen hanging on his saddle horn and assumed it was Clem's idea of a joke. The birth was attended by Alma Dorsey, who was also a capable midwife, and it was difficult and long, and Eli spent 7 of the worst hours of his life pacing the kitchen unable to help, which was a particular kind of suffering he had not previously understood. And then Alma came out and said, "She's fine and so is he." And Eli sat down on the kitchen step in the October cold and dropped his head into his hands and breathed. They named him Thomas for her first husband, which was Nora's idea and which Eli agreed to without a moment's hesitation because it was right and it was true, and it honored the full truth of her life. Thomas James Redmond, which held both the father before him and the small brother he had never known, carrying both names forward with the living one. He was a loud baby and a determined one, with his mother's dark eyes and Eli's ridiculous appetite for observation. And from the first weeks it was clear that he was going to be a person of strong opinions. Nora nursed him and rocked him and moved through the changed shape of her days with the same steady capability she brought to everything. And Eli watched her with a love so large, he sometimes had to step outside and look at the sky just to accommodate it. The first winter with the baby was full and noisy and completely different from all the winters before. The house that had been too quiet for too long was now full of the particular sound and smell and weight of a newborn, and then an infant and the business of caring for him. And the nights were interrupted, and the days were rearranged around his needs. And both Eli and Nora moved through it with a tiredness that was also, paradoxically, a deep aliveness. Clem from the livery, now 16 and growing into a broad-shouldered, quiet young man, came out on Saturdays to help with the heavier work. He had developed an attachment to the Redmond household that was partly motivated by Nora's cooking, and partly by the fact that Eli was the closest thing he had to a steady adult figure, his own father having left when he was small. Eli taught him to read a survey line and how to figure a proper fence angle, and Nora taught him to put up preserves, which he accepted with a dignity that made her laugh. The spring of 1880 came with its reliably transformative force, and the kitchen garden went back in, bigger this time, with new beds turned on the east side where the soil proved excellent, and Nora's commerce at the Saturday market in Harlan Creek had grown enough that they were looking at the possibility of a small proper structure for storing and processing the dried goods. She was in the garden one morning in April, Thomas on a blanket beside her in the sun, babbling at the sky with the earnest authority of a 6-month-old, when Eli came back from his morning patrol. He dismounted at the gate and stood watching the two of them for a long moment, the woman he loved in her garden that was thriving, their son making his commentary on the clouds, the bay mare clover dozing in the lean-to and the fence standing straight, and the fullness of it was something he could not have imagined standing in the livery 2 years prior, turning a frozen canteen in his hands. He went through the gate and crossed the yard, and Nora looked up and shaded her eyes against the sun. "Good patrol?" she asked. "Good enough," he said. He crouched on his heels beside the blanket and offered Thomas his finger, which Thomas immediately seized with a grip of preposterous strength. "The North Spring is running well again. Good sign for the summer." "Good," she said, and went back to her planting. She dug a small hole with her trowel and set a seedling with careful hands. "I was thinking," she said in the tone she used when she had been thinking for some time about the east bed, "whether there's enough room for another row of tomatoes or whether I should put the corn there instead." "Corn," he said. "You can trade corn for more than tomatoes." She considered this, then nodded. "Corn it is." He sat in the dirt beside his son and watched his wife plant corn with the April sun warm on the yard, and the creek sound coming up faintly from the east, and the whole world, for all its genuine and continuing injustice and difficulty and unpredictability, feeling at this specific moment, and in this specific acre of Texas entirely, unambiguously right. Thomas reached up from the blanket and grabbed a fistful of Eli's vest and stared at him with the complete, searching attention of the very young. Eli looked back at him with the complete, searching attention of a man who understood clearly what he was looking at. "Hello," he said to his son. Thomas said something emphatic and unintelligible, which Eli chose to take as agreement. By the summer of 1880, the Redmond property, as it was now known to the county records and to the people of Harlan Creek, had become something of a landmark in the quiet way that honest, well-kept places did. The house had been extended by a single room on the north side, which Eli and Nora and Clem had built together that spring out of stone and adobe, the same material as the original, so the addition matched and the whole thing looked as though it had always been exactly this size. The new room was for Thomas as he grew, and it had a window that faced the morning, which Nora had insisted on. The kitchen garden had produced more that summer than she had dared to plan for. The dried goods operation had outgrown the house entirely, and there was now a small separate structure near the gate, a proper little smokehouse cum drying room that Eli had built correctly this time, with a good draw and a plank floor. And the Saturday market stall had become one of the more reliable operations in the Harlan Creek market, which Nora ran with a commercial clarity that combined fairness and a complete absence of sentimentality in approximately equal measure. Alma Dorsey had taken to stopping by the stall and buying Nora's dried tomatoes in quantity for the dining room, which she said were the best in the county, and this had become a small standing partnership that suited both women well. In October of 1880, on the second anniversary of the morning Eli had first found the canteen, he rode out on his morning patrol, and when he came back and put Biscuit in the linta for the night he found, hanging from the saddle horn, a tin canteen with a strip of clean rawhide tied in a small careful knot around the neck. He stood in the linta with the canteen in his hand and laughed, a proper laugh that came from somewhere real and low in his chest, and Biscuit looked at him with the patient, mild look of a horse accustomed to human behavior. He carried the canteen inside, and Nora was at the stove stirring something that smelled of onions and dried beans, Thomas on her hip engaging in a running monologue of his own invention, and she looked up when Eli came in and her face was perfectly composed and her eyes were dancing. "It's the anniversary," she said. He set the canteen on the table. He went to her and took Thomas from her hip and settled him against his shoulder, and with his free hand he tucked a loose piece of her hair back behind her ear and he said, "It's the best anniversary I know." "Better than our wedding anniversary," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Different," he said. "The wedding anniversary is the day I married you. This is the day you started feeding me." She turned back to the stove, but he saw her smile. "You remember the exact morning." "I remember everything about it," he said. "I remember picking it up and thinking Clem had left a joke. I remember how full it was. I remember thinking whoever had tied that knot knew what they were doing." She was quiet for a moment, stirring. "I stood outside the livery gate for 5 minutes before I could make myself go in," she said. "I was afraid someone would see me." He looked at her back at the line of her shoulders. "What changed your mind?" "I thought about you out there on the dry north section with nothing to drink," she said. "And I thought about what my mother would have done. She would have left the water." She paused. "So I left the water." He crossed the kitchen and kissed the side of her neck above her collar, and she made a sound that was half exasperated and half entirely satisfied and said, "You'll disturb the beans." And he stepped back with Thomas still on his hip and sat down at the kitchen table and watched her cook, and their son put a determined hand in his hair and grabbed a fistful, and the evening settled in warm and close and real around all of them. The years that followed had the quality of a good thing built properly, not flashy, not effortless, but solid and warm and continually, quietly rewarding. Eli continued his work at the land office through 1881 and into 1882, during which time he successfully documented and secured the claim renewals for all 3 of the homestead families in the north section that had been under pressure from the Mackey operations expansion. He had become, through careful and persistent work, something of a reference point for smaller landholders in the county who found themselves in legal tangles with larger interests, and he took this responsibility seriously and without complaint. In early 1882, Nora told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same direct way she had told him the first time, in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee. Thomas, now 2½ and occupied with a wooden horse that Eli had carved for him, this one considerably better than the cedar box had been because his carving had improved with practice. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was what he always asked. "Very," she said. "Are you?" "Extremely," he said. Their daughter arrived in September of 1882, a small fierce creature with Eli's lighter coloring and Nora's absolute certainty about what she wanted, which in the first months was milk and company, and to be heard. They named her Clara, for Eli's mother, whose name had been Clarissa, shortened to a name that could survive a Texas childhood. With Clara in the house, the family was complete in a way that Eli recognized not as a stopping point, but as a fullness, the way a good well was complete, not empty and not overflowing, but full, the water right there, clear and available and real. Thomas was devoted to his sister from the start in the way of a small boy who has been the sole center of attention, and is somewhat relieved to have a new subject for the household's focus besides himself. He brought her things, small rocks and interesting sticks, and once a live frog that Nora dealt with efficiently, and he talked to her in a running commentary that was clearly inherited from his father's habit of explaining the land as they rode across it. Eli had started taking Thomas out on shorter patrol rides as soon as the boy could sit a saddle steadily, which was earlier than most people expected. He sat in front of Eli on Biscuit, serious and attentive, and Eli talked to him about the land, the survey lines and the watercourses, and the way the grass grew differently in wet soil and dry, the way you could read a slope to predict where the water ran, the way the sky changed before a weather shift. Thomas listened with an intensity that was entirely his mother's, filing things away with a quiet thoroughness that made Eli proud in the particular way that went beyond pride into something more like wonder. Nora watched them ride out and ride back in from the porch, and she had a look on her face during those moments that was the full unheld version of who she was, no restraint in it, just love, clean and entire, looking at her husband and her son coming home across the greening land. In the spring of 1883, Eli was offered a promotion to the state land office in Austin, which was a considerable recognition of his work, and would have meant a significant increase in his salary and his standing. He brought the letter home and laid it on the kitchen table and looked at Nora. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you want," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Thomas was in the yard with Clem, who was 18 now and had become a near-permanent fixture of the Redmond property in the way that certain people did when they found a place where they fit. Clara was asleep in her crib in the new room. The April light was coming through the kitchen window in long gold columns. "This is my land," Nora said. "You know that." "I know that," he said. "I'm not going to Austin," she said. "But that doesn't mean I want to make that choice for you." He looked at her across the table. "Nora, you know where I want to be." She met his eyes. Her face was even and her eyes were dark and clear. "Here," she said. It was not a question. "Here," he said. "Nowhere else." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then write back and say thank you, but no." He wrote back and said thank you, but no. The spring of 1883 went into summer and then into fall and then into the winter and back around again, and the Redmond property expanded slowly and well. A second horse was added, a young gray gelding that Thomas named Dust, which was an entirely accurate description. The east bed of the garden became a full corn section, and the kitchen garden proper moved to new beds on the south wall, where it got better light. The drying house was expanded and a proper shelf system installed, and Nora's dried goods operation had grown to the point where she was supplying 3 establishments in Harlan Creek and 1 supply wagon that ran to 2 other towns. The land itself, the 120 acres that Thomas Carver had filed on and Nora had fought to keep and Eli had helped her hold, had become something genuinely their own in the fullest sense, worked, known, lived on, loved. The fences stood straight. The well ran clear. The kitchen garden had achieved the kind of deep, amended fertility that came from years of careful tending, and the corn came up tall and clean on the east section every summer. One evening in the fall of 1884, Eli and Nora sat on the porch in the last of the evening light, which was the Amberandrose variety unique to Texas autumn, the kind that made the land look like something out of a painting. Thomas was inside doing his letters. Nora had been teaching him with the same methodical patience she brought to all instruction, and he had surpassed what she expected, and was already reading simple texts on his own. Clara was in the yard with Clem, who was attempting to teach her to throw a ball with mixed success and considerable laughter. Eli had a cup of coffee and Nora had tea, and they were not talking, just sitting in the good evening quiet, and Eli was looking at the land as he always looked at it, with the attention he had brought to it since the first survey rides 3 years before any of this had happened. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked, which was not a question she asked often. He thought about it honestly, because she always wanted honesty. "I'm thinking about the morning I found the first canteen," he said. "And how it seemed like such a small thing, and how it was, in fact, exactly that large." She looked at him. The evening light was on her face, and she was 33 years old, and the line of her cheekbones was exactly as it had been on the day he first saw her in the doorway, with her chin up and her dark eyes watchful, but it was softer now, lived in, fully itself. "6 weeks," she said. "I left them for 6 weeks." "I know," he said. "I counted them." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "I kept waiting for you to say something about it, to make it into something. You're the kind of man who notices things." "I noticed," he said. "I came and found you." "Come eat," she said, and the words had the quality of something old and funny and entirely theirs, and she smiled the real smile, the one he still had to be careful about because it still, every time, made him feel 17 and ridiculous. "It was the right thing to say," he said. "It was the only thing that would have worked," she said, and turned back to look at the land, and he turned back too, and they sat together in the Texas autumn evening with their life around them. The lit windows of the house, the sound of their children, Clover and Biscuit, and dust in the lean-to, the first stars coming up above the eastern ridge, the land their own, and the night coming in clean and cold and entirely, completely good. Clara came running across the yard and climbed directly onto Nora's lap without asking permission, as was her habit, and Nora folded her arms around her daughter with the ease of a woman who had made peace with the full and complicated and unearned grace of her life. Eli put his arm around Nora's shoulders and she leaned into him, which she did not always do in company, but evening on the porch was not company, it was just theirs. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Thomas appeared in the doorway with his reading book under his arm, looking for all the world like a small, serious man, and said that supper was going to burn if nobody came inside, which was an excellent point because Nora had left beans on the stove, and they all went in together through the warm-lit doorway, the Texas night settling gentle and dark behind them, the stars enormous and certain overhead, and the canteen, Nora's canteen, the old dented tin one with the rawhide knot, hanging on its hook by the door where she kept it, not because it was needed, not because the root was dry or the well was low or the man who rode it was a stranger, but because it was hers, and because it was the beginning, and because some things you kept not for use but for what they meant, and what it meant was this: that she had seen someone who needed something and she had given what she had, and he had come to find her and she had let him, and that was the whole of it.